February 16th, 2026, a Tuesday morning in downtown Toronto. A software engineer walks into a Starbucks, orders a medium coffee, and pays $7.50. She doesn't flinch. She's used to it now. The Canadian dollar has been bleeding value for so long that expensive coffee feels normal. She opens her phone and checks the news. The top headline isn't from Ottawa. It's from Washington. Another tariff threat from the White House just dropped. The loonie falls another 2 cents before she finishes reading. She pays her rent to a numbered company registered in Delaware. She works for a tech startup that's really just a satellite office for a firm in Austin. Her retirement savings are mostly in U.S. stocks because Canadian equities barely move. She feels Canadian. She has a maple leaf on her backpack. But if you follow the money, if you trace every transaction in her life back to its origin, you realize something disturbing. The border isn't a wall. It's a formality. We think Canada is an independent country because it has a flag, a parliament, and a national anthem. We're wrong. Canada didn't lose its independence in a war. It sold it on installment, one mortgage at a time, one brain drain at a time, one resource contract at a time. This is the story of how a nation quietly became a subsidiary. And the ledger tells the whole truth. Let's go back to when Canada felt like a giant. The year is 1995. The Canadian dollar is strong, hovering near 75 cents U.S. The economy is diversifying. Tech is booming in Waterloo and Ottawa. The country has just balanced its federal budget after years of deficits. Canadians are proud. They mock Americans for their crime rates and lack of health care. Toronto is being called New York run by the Swiss. Vancouver is a Pacific gateway to Asia. The future looks bright, independent, and uniquely Canadian. There are parades on Canada Day. There's a sense that the country has figured out a third way between American capitalism and European socialism. But beneath the surface, beneath the politeness and the optimism, the foundation was rotting. The economy was already addicted to 3 things: American consumption, foreign capital inflows, and rising home prices. These 3 addictions would slowly, politely, drain the country of its sovereignty. The first trap was the trade umbilical cord. By the time NAFTA was fully implemented in 1994, Canada had made a Faustian bargain. It had tied its entire export economy to a single customer. By 2025, that dependency had reached a staggering 77%. That's not a trade relationship. That's a hostage situation. In the business world, if one client provides more than 50% of your revenue, you don't have a business. You have a job, and your client is your boss. Canada had become a company town, and the company was the United States of America. The numbers are brutal. In 2024, Canada exported $592 billion worth of goods. Of that, $456 billion went south of the border. Energy, cars, lumber, aluminum, machinery, all of it flowing in one direction. When Donald Trump threatened a 10% tariff in 2025, the entire Canadian stock market shuddered. The loonie dropped 3% in a single week. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland flew to Washington to beg for exemptions. That's not diplomacy between equals. That's a vassal pleading with an empire. The Canadian government had no leverage. None. Because the alternative to selling to America was selling to no one. Then there's the currency trap. The Canadian dollar used to be called the loonie because of the bird on the coin. By 2025, it was being called the loonie because holding it felt like a joke. The dollar had been hovering in the 70-cent range for years. It dipped to 69 cents in late 2025. The government spun this as good news. A weak currency makes exports cheaper. But let's translate that into English. A weak currency means you're the discount aisle. It means your labor is cheap. Your resources are cheap. Your entire country is on sale. When the loonie was at par in 2011, Canadians felt rich. They vacationed in Florida and spent freely. By 2025, crossing the border felt like entering a luxury store you couldn't afford. Everything in America looked expensive because the Canadian dollar was worthless. This wasn't a temporary dip. This was structural decline. The loonie's value is a report card, and Canada was failing. But the real monster lurking in the ledger was the productivity crisis. In 2024, the Bank of Canada published a report that should have been treated as a national emergency. Canadian productivity had stagnated for 15 years. GDP per capita in the United States had pulled ahead of Canada by nearly $20,000. That's not a gap, that's a chasm. While American workers were generating more wealth per hour, Canadian workers were stuck. Why? Because Canada had stopped investing in the future. The country was digging rocks out of the ground and selling houses to each other. There was no innovation, no risk-taking, no billion-dollar startups, just real estate speculation and resource extraction, the same economic model as a colony. And when your productivity lags behind your neighbors, your currency falls. Your wages stagnate, your best workers leave. Which brings us to the second trap, the brain drain. Imagine you're 24 years old. You just graduated from the University of Waterloo with a degree in software engineering. You're one of the best in the country. The Canadian taxpayer spent roughly $120,000 subsidizing your education. You have 2 job offers on the table. Option 1 is in Toronto. The salary is $90,000 Canadian. Rent for a 1-bedroom apartment is $2,600 a month. You will never own a home in that city. Option 2 is in Seattle. The salary is $140,000 US. That's nearly $200,000 Canadian. Rent is cheaper relative to income. The weather is better. The tech scene is bigger. You'll pay less tax if you're smart about it. Which do you choose? If you stay in Canada, you're paying a patriotism tax of $100,000 per year. Most don't stay. Data suggests that in some graduating classes, up to 80% of top engineering students leave for the United States within 2 years. Canada is running a taxpayer-funded talent incubator for Silicon Valley. This is colonialism in reverse. The colony pays to train the workers, and the empire harvests them for free. It gets worse. Canada is also bleeding doctors and nurses. Thousands of Canadian-trained physicians now hold licenses in border states like Michigan, New York, and Washington. They leave because the pay is better and the bureaucracy is lighter. Meanwhile, millions of Canadians don't have access to a family doctor. The wait time for an MRI can stretch beyond a year in some provinces. The healthcare system, the one thing Canadians brag about, is collapsing under its own weight, and the people trained to fix it are cashing American paychecks. The cycle is vicious. Canada pays for childhood health care and education. The worker becomes productive in their 20s. Then they leave. The United States gets a fully trained, debt-free, highly skilled worker without spending a dime. Canada gets a postcard and a hole in the workforce. By 2025, estimates suggest that Canada had lost over 300,000 skilled workers to the United States in the previous decade. That's not a brain drain, that's a brain hemorrhage. And every person who leaves takes their future tax payments with them. The compound loss to the Canadian economy is measured in tens of billions of dollars. Now let's talk about the housing trap, because this is where sovereignty goes to die. In most developed nations, housing is a utility. It's a place to sleep so you can wake up and go to work. In Canada, housing became the economy. The country didn't build the next Google or invent the next medical breakthrough. It built condos, lots of condos, and it sold them to each other for more money every 5 years. By 2021, residential investment as a share of GDP in Canada was nearly double that of the United States. Think about what that means. Billions of dollars that should have gone into research, startups, and infrastructure were poured into concrete and drywall. The entire economy became a real estate Ponzi scheme. Prices only go up if new buyers keep entering the market. And for years they did. Immigrants arrived. Foreign capital flooded in. Prices doubled, then tripled. A house in Vancouver that sold for $400,000 in 2005 was worth $2 million by 2021. People felt rich. But they weren't. They were just holding appreciating debt. Here's the sovereignty problem. To keep that bubble inflated, Canada needed constant inflows of foreign money. The government turned a blind eye to money laundering for years. Luxury condos in Toronto and Vancouver were bought with cash by shell companies. No one asked where the money came from. The term snow washing entered the lexicon. Canada had become a laundromat for global capital. By the time the government implemented a foreign buyer ban in 2022, the damage was done. Entire neighborhoods were owned by offshore entities. When your housing market is propped up by foreign capital, you lose control. You can't set your own interest rates without risking a crash. You can't cool the market without triggering a recession. You're trapped. The Bank of Canada became a hostage negotiator, trying to manage inflation without popping the bubble. But inflation was imported. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raised rates in 2022, Canada had no choice but to follow. If they didn't, capital would flee south. The loonie would collapse. So they raised rates. Mortgages became unaffordable. People started defaulting. The housing market froze. And the entire Canadian banking system, which had lent out trillions in mortgages, started to sweat. By 2025, Canadian household debt had reached 185% of disposable income. That means for every dollar a Canadian earned, they owed $1.85. That's one of the highest debt loads in the developed world. The average Canadian was one layoff, one rate hike, or one medical emergency away from insolvency. And if the bubble actually burst, if housing prices fell by 30 or 40%, the fallout would be catastrophic. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation insures a massive portion of these mortgages. That means the taxpayer is on the hook. If defaults spiked, the government would need a bailout. And where would that money come from? Not Ottawa. They're running deficits. It would come from international credit markets, which means U.S.-dominated financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. Canada would be forced to accept austerity measures, structural adjustments, and loss of fiscal sovereignty. This isn't speculation. This is what happens to every country that borrows beyond its means. Ask Greece. Ask Argentina. Sovereignty is solvency, and Canada is insolvent. Let's move north, far north, to the place Canadians claim is theirs but can't defend, the Arctic. As the ice melts, the Northwest Passage is opening. It's becoming a shipping highway that will save billions in transport costs. But who controls it? Canada says it's internal waters. The United States, the European Union, and China say it's an international strait. This isn't a legal debate. It's a sovereignty test. And Canada is failing. The Canadian Armed Forces are underfunded, understaffed, and under-equipped. For decades, Canada has spent less than 2% of GDP on defense. The NATO target is 2%. Canada has missed it almost every year. Why? Because the assumption was simple. The Americans will protect us. If a Russian bomber flies over the North Pole, the U.S. Air Force will shoot it down. Canada has been free riding on American security for 70 years. But that free ride comes with a price, dependence. In 2028, imagine this scenario. A Chinese research vessel flanked by 2 icebreakers sails through the Northwest Passage without asking Canada for permission. What does Canada do? It sends a Coast Guard ship that's 30 years old and half the size. The Chinese ignore it. Canada calls the Americans. The U.S. Navy shows up, but they're not there to defend Canadian sovereignty. They're there to secure North American security, and in doing so, they implicitly take control. The Northwest Passage becomes a U.S.-managed waterway. Canada becomes a protectorate. A protectorate is a territory that's technically independent, but whose defense and foreign policy are controlled by a stronger state. That's what Canada is becoming. The U.S. Department of Defense is already funding radar installations in the Canadian Arctic. They're using the Defense Production Act, a wartime law, to invest in Canadian critical mineral mines. They're not asking for permission. They're telling Canada what's going to happen. Because if Canada won't secure the North, Washington will. Sovereignty is not a gift, it's a capability. And Canada has lost the capability to defend itself. Now let's talk about culture. Because this is where the erosion is most invisible and most total. Open your phone. Scroll through Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube for 5 minutes. How much of what you see is Canadian? Almost none. Unless you actively seek out Canadian content, your feed is American. The algorithm doesn't care about borders. It cares about engagement. And American culture dominates global engagement. For decades, Canada protected its culture with CanCon laws. Radio stations had to play Canadian music. TV stations had to air Canadian shows. It created a bubble. But the Internet destroyed that bubble. Netflix, YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok don't follow CanCon rules. They follow algorithms coded in California. And those algorithms have no incentive to promote Canadian content. The result? Cultural erasure. Canadian creators face a brutal choice. If they make content about Canada, the algorithm buries them. They get shown only to a small Canadian audience. But if they strip away their identity, if they talk about American politics, American trends, and American cities, the algorithm rewards them. They go viral. They make money. So a generation of Canadian creators is actively hiding their Canadianness to survive. They say dollars instead of loonies. They say the city instead of Toronto. They talk about Trump instead of Trudeau. This is self-colonization, and it's happening at scale. By 2025, surveys showed that Canadian teenagers knew more about U.S. politics than Canadian politics. They could name the U.S. president, but not the Canadian prime minister. They used American constitutional arguments and debates, forgetting that Canada's constitution is completely different. People were arrested at protests in Ottawa and screamed about their First Amendment rights. In Canada, the First Amendment recognizes Manitoba as a province. They didn't know that, because they'd been raised on American media. Then came the news ban. In 2023, the Canadian government passed Bill C-18, forcing Meta and Google to pay news organizations for content. It was a clumsy attempt to save Canadian journalism. Meta's response was swift and brutal. They deleted all news from Facebook and Instagram in Canada. Overnight, millions of Canadians lost access to journalism on the platforms they used most. During the 2023 wildfire crisis, people couldn't share evacuation routes on Facebook. The tech giant had called Canada's bluff, and Canada blinked. The message was clear. Silicon Valley is more powerful than Ottawa. A private company can delete the news in an entire country with one line of code. That's not sovereignty. That's digital colonialism. When your population consumes American news, watches American movies, listens to American podcasts, and adapts their behavior to please American algorithms, you don't have a culture. You have a tributary state. Let's dig into the ground now. Literally, because sovereignty isn't just about culture and currency. It's about resources. And Canada has always been a resource colony. In the 1600s, it was fur. In the 1800s, it was timber. In the 1900s, it was wheat and oil. In 2025, it's critical minerals. The pattern never changes. Canada digs it up, Canada ships it raw. Someone else refines it, manufactures it, and sells it back at a markup. Hewers of wood and drawers of water. That phrase was used in the 1960s to describe Canada's economy. It's still accurate today. Take oil. Canada has the third largest oil reserves in the world. It should be an energy superpower, but it's not, because 99% of Canadian oil exports go to one buyer, the United States. When you have one customer, you don't set the price. They do. Western Canadian Select, the benchmark for Canadian oil, trades at a steep discount compared to West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark. Canada loses billions every year because it has no leverage. Remember the Keystone 40 pipeline. It was supposed to secure energy independence by moving Canadian oil to the Gulf Coast. Ottawa begged for it, conservative and liberal governments alike. Then, on January 20, 2021, President Joe Biden killed it. Day one signature, no negotiation. No consultation. Canada responded with a polite statement of disappointment. That wasn't diplomacy between equals. That was a superpower dismissing a subordinate. But oil is yesterday's war. The real battle is over critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. The backbone of batteries, electric vehicles, and modern technology. China dominates global supply, and the United States is scrambling to break that dependence. So it looked north. Canada sits on enormous mineral reserves, especially in the Ring of Fire, and in 2022, the Pentagon invoked the Defense Production Act to fund mining projects on Canadian soil. Let that sink in. The U.S. military used a wartime law to secure resources in another country. They call it friendshoring. It sounds friendly. But in reality, it integrates Canada into the American military-industrial supply chain, not as a partner, but as a supplier. The risk is simple. Canada extracts, America builds. The value, jobs, and power flow south. The environmental cost stays north. It's an old colonial model, just electrified. And when a superpower needs your resources for national security, sovereignty stops being theoretical. It becomes negotiable.